Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Congressman Jamie Raskin. Congressman, I really appreciate you coming on today.
Hey, I'm delighted to be with you, Brittany.
You recently reintroduced the Fifth Amendment Integrity Restoration Act, the FAIR Act, with Representative Tim Walberg. Can you give us the history behind the legislation?
Well, I'll give you my personal history behind it because I was fighting this battle very much as a state senator in Maryland because it came to my attention that there were lots of cases of the police stopping people in the street or stopping them in their cars and not arresting them, not charging them with any offense, but saying, it looks like you might be involved in drugs. It looks like you might be up to no good. I'm just going to take your car, or I'm going to take your money. Give me all your money. Or I'll take some other piece of property on you. And then the person had to go to court, find a lawyer, and sue to get their property back. And so it totally turned on its head every understanding I had from the Constitution about the presumption of innocence and due process. And the same thing is taking place, but on a much broader magnitude at the federal level, where we're talking about billions of dollars that are being forfeited to the FBI and the Department of Justice and other agencies. And again, all of the constitutional presumptions are reversed. So the government's just laying claim to people's property, taking it, and then the person has to go out and get a lawyer to try to sue the government to get it back, instead of the government having first to prosecute you and prove beyond a reasonable doubt you did something, and then prove that the property was involved in the crime, either as an instrument of the crime or a proceed of the crime. But instead, the government is just taking it, and then you've got to, fight tooth and nail to get it back. So our legislation would try to restore constitutional coherence to this interaction between the government and the citizen.
Congressman, you bring up a really interesting point about the presumption of innocence. Are civil asset forfeiture laws, as written now, basically guilty until proven innocent?
Well, your property is guilty until proven innocent. And so we're making sure, Congressman Walberg and I want to make sure that if the government seizes your property, whether it's a car, it's a boat, it's your money, it's jewelry, whatever it might be, that the government has to very quickly go and create a proceeding, usually 7 days, or it has to notify you within 7 days it's gotten it and declare exactly what it is. And then within 14 days, it's got to come in and try to prove that by clear and convincing evidence that your property is ill-gotten gains or was an instrument, a tool of crime, and therefore can be seized by the government. But it's got to make the proof. And we're ending the process of so-called administrative forfeitures, where an agency or police department or the FBI could just declare that your property is up to no good and take it from you. Instead, it's got to be run through a neutral, independent magistrate. A court has got to do it, and they've got to prove by clear and convincing evidence that your property is implicated in some kind of crime. But some of these stories will break your heart. I get them all the time now. There's one that involving a woman named Linda Martin, who wanted to save her money in a safe deposit box. A lot of people are afraid of banks, and hey, I mean, you see the news, that's not totally deranged to be afraid of banks. But anyway, she wanted to save her money, which is a totally lawful thing to do, in a safe deposit box. And the company, U.S. Private Vaults, got charged with stuff by the government, and then they seized everybody's private assets, and they were all kind of guilty by association, and she hadn't done anything other than put her money in there to be saved. There was a case that I dealt with in Maryland where a guy lived in Baltimore, but he was going to college in Western Maryland. So he's driving back and forth, and he got stopped in a car that he had bought recently. And the police did a search of the car and found traces of the car, which had been a used car. They found traces of marijuana in the back seat, which apparently you can find in like 50% of the cars in America, traces of marijuana. So they did a search of him. He had no marijuana on him. He wasn't smoking marijuana. He wasn't dealing marijuana. He had nothing to do with marijuana. He was traveling between him and his wife and daughter in Baltimore and going to school, but they just seized his car. So then he had no way to get to school. So then he was forced to drop out of school because he couldn't go. He forfeited an entire semester's tuition. He's a poor working class guy. And if it hadn't been for, I think it was the ACLU or maybe the Institute of Justice, he never would have been able to get it back. But finally, 2 years later, he was able to get it back. But in the meantime, they completely disrupted his life. The stories like this are legion. I mean, just story after story where you get police seizing people's property. You find out about the innocent ones. Some of them are people who might have been like smoking pot. Take that example of somebody who had been smoking pot and then they seized their car. Well, I don't know what I think about that. I mean, it's against the law to possess marijuana. There's a penalty for that. But seizing somebody's car and making it impossible for them to get to work and take their kids to school or whatever, I mean, it's just wrong. So anyway, we're trying to restore the rule of law to this whole field because there's something that's kind of monarchical about the idea that we live in like a kingdom and the king's forces can just go out and seize everybody's property.
Congressman, off the top of your head, you just said 2 stories. You said you have countless stories just like this, and you've called this before. It's becoming standard operating procedure in many parts of the country. How did this become what you describe as standard?
Well, there's a financial motive and there's a financial incentive there. It works different ways in different jurisdictions, but generally the law enforcement agency that's doing it and whatever cooperating agencies get a cut out of the money. And, I've seen cases where police departments build entire new gymnasiums, they build a swimming pool. Sometimes if they get a fancy car from a suspected drug dealer, the force gets to keep it for their use, condos, you name it. I mean, so another thing that our legislation does is it terminates the profit incentive for federal law enforcement to be forfeiting people's property by requiring that the proceeds be sent in to the General Treasury Fund rather than kept by the seizing entity.
The ACLU has called civil forfeiture, quote, policing for profit, generating millions of dollars annually that police departments get to keep. Under your legislation, where would forfeiture proceeds go?
I mean, it goes to the American people through the General Treasury Fund. So obviously we have deficits and debt in the country. If this money is lawfully seized, if it really is ill-gotten gains, if it really is a boat that's being used for purposes of drug dealing, and there's a civil asset forfeiture statute, and then it is properly forfeited by having the government bring an action, and it's proven by clear and convincing evidence that it's being used criminally and due process is observed, and finally the boat is then forfeited, then it should be sold and the money should go into the General Treasury, or the boat should be used for perhaps other purposes, but it shouldn't go to the agents who happen to make the bust. I think everybody can see the moral hazard involved in that, and that cuts against the idea of law enforcement being for a public purpose and not for the purpose of enriching or feathering the nest of a particular agency or law enforcement department.
Congressman, I'm really interested to know what the response has been to your legislation. I talked to your colleague, Representative Tim Walberg, the Republican who introduced this with you, or rather reintroduced this with you. He said he's been working on this for a few terms now, almost 6 years. So what's the likelihood of this getting passed?
Well, I think that there are a lot of progressives who are very upset about this. There are a lot of progressives who represent urban areas where this kind of shakedown is a common practice, where police will see a young person on the street who has $50 or $100 on them and say, there's no way that's really your money, that's drug money, and just take it from them. And then it goes theoretically to the department, or who knows where it goes. But there are also a lot of people from rural areas who are familiar with this practice as well. And so I think it cuts across urban and rural lines, and it cuts across party lines. And, I think there is at least a libertarian wing of the Republican Party that doesn't like this. There is a kind of more authoritarian, quote, law and order component within the Republican Party, which might not want to mess with the whole bureaucracy of civil asset forfeiture. But in truth, this doesn't have much to do with law and order at all. I mean, this is pretty lawless, the practice that's taking place. And it feels like it's very much at odds with the values of democracy and freedom that are really at the heart of our Constitution.
Congressman, you said this cuts across party lines. Based on your legislation, it seems to appear that way. You reintroduced it with a Republican, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats co-sponsored it. Why do you think there is such bipartisan support when it comes to this legislation?
Well, the idea of the presumption of innocence, the idea of due process, the idea that the government has to make a case against you rather than you have to go and make a case against the government after the government seizes your property. All of these are basic American values and ideas. And I don't think they're affixed to any particular political party. I think they're embedded in the tissue of the Constitution. And so, wherever we find constitutional patriots, they could call themselves liberals or conservatives or radicals or libertarians or Greens or whatever. Those are people who are not going to like the idea that the state can arrogate to itself the power to declare your property guilty and then put the burden of proof on you and put the burden of persuasion on you and get the burden of finding lawyers on you, get the burden of setting a court date on you, and then you have to go and prove your property is innocent. It just doesn't make any sense. So, the Constitution protects not just your life and your liberty, but it protects your property too.
Congressman, in the spirit of bipartisanship, aside from this legislation, are there any other policy areas that you're planning to work with Republicans on?
Well, I work with Republicans all the time whenever I can. I mean, my friend Nancy Mace from South Carolina, who's in the GOP, she and I just wrote a letter that I think 24 members signed on with us to the Royal Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, telling him to release every political prisoner he's got behind bars for sending tweets. He puts people in prison for sending tweets that are critical of the government. How appalling is that? But, there are a lot of policy things that I've done with Republican friends, marijuana decriminalization, ending, very draconian mandatory minimum sentences in drug cases. I've done that both at the state and the federal level. Anything dealing with openness and transparency in government. Back when I was a state senator, one of my colleagues and I, who is actually currently in Congress with me now, Alex Mooney, he was a Maryland state senator. Now he's a congressman from West Virginia, but that's a different story. But anyway, we sponsored legislation to require that all governmental expenditures above $10,000 in Maryland be put online within 24 hours so everybody knows where government spending is going. I believe in that. I believe in that strongly. We have political parties because we need them to help organize public opinion and to have competitive elections and to try to put forward programs that we then translate into legislative agendas. But it's very important for us to remember when we're elected what a party is. I mean, the word party comes from the French word parti. It means a part of the whole. And our party is just part of the whole. And we have to go in with the idea we're going to try to represent everybody who's in our constituency, whether they voted for us or they didn't, whether they're a Democrat, a Republican, a Libertarian, an Independent, a Green, Reform Party, whatever. We have to try to represent everybody. And you know what? We know how to be nonpartisan. If you come to my district office in Rockville, Maryland, and you've got a problem with Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid or whatever it might be, we don't ask what your political party registration is. We just ask, do you live in my district? And if you live in my district, we go to bat for you, and we will do whatever we can to achieve satisfaction in whatever problem you're having with the government. That's the mentality we got to bring to public policy. It doesn't mean we're going to agree on everything. Obviously, there are some fundamental differences we've got on questions like abortion or what have you. But when I fight for pro-choice, I'm not fighting for pro-choice just for Democratic women because I'm a Democrat. I'm fighting for pro-choice for all women. You know, and so I'm trying to think about everybody and not just the people who belong to my own political party designation.
Congressman, you bring up a really interesting point because we hear all the time it's a highly partisan, it's a highly divided time, but you just laid out some policy areas you are working with Republicans on. So do you think that's really true?
The strategy of division and polarization is deliberate and premeditated. And some of it comes from abroad. I mean, Vladimir Putin would love nothing more than for everybody in America to beat each other's throats along party lines, along racial, ethnic, religious lines. If you look at what Putin did in 2016 is he pumped all kinds of poison into the bloodstream of America through social media propaganda in order to drive people apart and make people hate each other. So I think some of it is coming from autocrats and theocrats and plutocrats abroad who want to see democracy fail in America. Some of it undoubtedly is native born and in American domestic politics because people think that the way to succeed in politics is to tear down the other side. Some of that has to do with the way the electoral system is set up. And, I'm all for reforming our elections to try to reduce negative politics and to build up coalitional politics. And one of the things I've been fighting for is ranked choice voting, so that instead of just trying to tear down other candidates, ranked choice voting says, oh, well, you might like Mr. Forbes number one, but I'd like to be your number two choice. And so I think Forbes is great, but you should check me out too. And then I don't have an incentive anymore to destroy him, but to try to appeal to his followers. And that's what ranked choice voting is doing. And I have a number of colleagues who've been getting elected under the ranked choice voting system, including the wonderful Mary Peltola, the first native Alaskan ever to be elected to Congress from Alaska, and also the first Democrat, I think, in 30 or 40 years. But she beat Sarah Palin in a ranked choice voting election, where she was able to appeal on a much broader basis to the public.
Congressman, I would love to have you back on to talk about ranked choice voting. But before I let you go, really quickly, what's next for the FAIR Act?
Well, Congressman Walberg is a tiger, and he and I are going to be fighting to get more and more Republicans and Democrats on it. Everybody should support it. It's a great piece of bipartisan legislation. And everybody says that they believe in civil freedom, and everybody says they believe in the Constitution. This is a great opportunity for people to show it in a case that's not been politicized along partisan lines.
Congressman Jamie Raskin, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.